Synopsis of the Gita. Chapter 1, entitled The Yoga of Dejection of Arjuna. 1 to 11 shlokas says, description of the principal warriors on both sides with their fighting qualities. 12 to 19 shlokas says, blowing of shankas by the warriors on both the sides. 20 to 27 shlokas says, Arjuna observes the warriors drawn up for battle. 28 to 47 shlokas says that, overwhelmed by infatuation, Arjuna gives expression to his faint-heartedness, tenderness, and grief. Chapter 2, entitled Sankhya Yoga or the Yoga of Knowledge. 1 to 10 shlokas says, Arjuna and Sri Krishna discussing Arjuna's faint-heartedness. 11 to 30th shlokas says, Sankhya Yoga, the Yoga of Knowledge, is described. 31 to 38 shlokas says the Kshatriya's duty to engage himself in fight. 39th to 53rd shloka says Karma Yoga, the Yoga of selfless action. 54 to 72 shlokas says marks of the man of stable mind and his glories. Chapter 3, entitled Karma Yoga or the Yoga of Action. 1 to 8 shlokas describes the importance of the performance of duty in a detached way according to both Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga. 9 to 16 shlokas says the necessity of performing sacrifices. 17 to 24 shlokas says the necessity for action on the part of the wise and even on the part of the God himself for the good of the world. 25 to 35 shlokas says marks of the wise and the unwise, instructions about performance of action without attraction and repulsion. 36 to 43 shlokas says how to overcome desire. Chapter 4, entitled The Yoga of Knowledge as well as the disciplines of action and knowledge. 1 to 18 shlokas says the glory of God with attributes, Karma Yoga or selfless action. 19 to 23 shlokas says the conduct of yogis and sages, its glory is described. 24 to 32 shlokas says different forms of sacrifices described with their fruits. 33 to 42 shlokas says the glory of the knowledge. Chapter 5, entitled The Yoga of Action and Knowledge. 1 to 6 shlokas says Sankhya Yoga and the Yoga of disinterested action. 7 to 12 shlokas says marks of the Sankhya Yogi and Niskama Karma Yogi. Their glories are described. 13 to 26 shlokas says Jnana Yoga or the Yoga of Knowledge. 27 to 29 shlokas says Dhyana Yoga or meditation together with devotion. Chapter 6, entitled The Yoga of Self-Control. 1 to 4 shlokas says Karma Yoga or the Yoga of disinterested action. Marks of one who has attained yoga is described. 5 to 10 shlokas says, urging one to uplift the self, marks of the God-realized soul is explained. 11 to 32 shlokas, detailed description of Dhyana Yoga. 33 to 36 shlokas, the question of mind control is discussed. 37 to 47 shlokas, the fate of one who falls from yoga, the glory of Dhyana Yoga is described. Chapter 7, entitled The Yoga of Jnana, knowledge of Nirguna Brahma, and Vijnana, knowledge of manifest divinity. 1 to 7 shlokas, wisdom with real knowledge of manifest divinity. 8 to 12 shlokas, inherence of God in all objects as their cause. 13 to 19 shlokas, condemnation of men of demoniacal nature and praise of devotees. 20 to 23 shlokas, the question of worship of other gods. 24 to 30 shlokas, condemnation of men who are ignorant of the glory and true nature of God, and approbation of those who know them. Chapter 8, entitled The Yoga of the Indestructible Brahma. 1 to 7 shlokas, answer to Arjuna's 7 questions on Brahma, Adhyatma and Karma, etc. 8 to 22 shlokas, the subject of Bhakti Yoga is discussed. 23 to 28 shlokas, the bright and dark paths are described. Chapter 9, entitled The Yoga of the Sovereign Science and the Sovereign Secret. 1 to 6 shlokas, the subject of Jnana, knowledge with its glory is described. 7 to 10 shlokas, the origin of the world is discussed. 11 to 15 shlokas, condemnation of men of the demonical nature who despise God and the method of bhajana of men possessed of the divine nature. 16 to 19 shlokas, description of God as the soul of everything and His glory. 20 to 25 shlokas, the fruits of worship with a motive and without motive. 26 to 34, the glory of devotion practiced disinterestedly. Chapter 10, entitled The Yoga of Divine Glories. 1 to 7 shlokas, description of God's glories and power of yoga with the fruit of their knowledge. 8 to 11 shlokas, Bhakti Yoga, its fruit and glory. 12 to 18 shlokas, Arjuna offers his praises to God and praise to the Lord for a description of his glories and power of yoga. 19 to 42nd shlokas, the Lord describes his glories and power of yoga. Chapter 11, entitled The Yoga of the Vision of the Universal Form. 1 to 4 shlokas, Arjuna prays to the Lord for a vision of his universal form. 5 to 8 shlokas, the Lord describes his universal form. 9 to 14 shlokas, the universal form described by Sanjaya to Dhritarashtra. 15 to 31 shlokas, Arjuna sees the Lord's universal form and offers praises to the Lord. 32 to 34 shlokas, God describes his glory and exhorts Arjuna to fight. 35 to 46 shlokas, overtaken by fright, Arjuna offers praises to God and prays for a sight of the Lord's four-armed form. 47 to 58th slokas. The Lord describes the glory of the vision of his universal form and reveals to Arjuna his four-armed gentle form. 51 to 55 shlokas. The impossibility of obtaining a sight of the four-armed form without exclusive devotion, which is described with its fruit. Chapter 12, entitled The Yoga of Devotion. 1 to 12 slokas says, respective merits of the worshippers of God with form and without form and the means of God realization. 13 to 28 slokas, marks of the God realized soul, is described. Chapter 13, entitled The Yoga of Discrimination between the field and the knower of the field. 1 to 8 shlokas, the subject of field and the knower of the field together with the knowledge is described. 19 to 34 shlokas, the subject of Prakriti and Purusa, matter and spirit together with knowledge. Chapter 13, entitled The Yoga of Discrimination between the field and the knower of the field. 1 to 18 shlokas, the subject of field and the knower of the field together with knowledge is described. 19 to 34 shlokas, the subject of Prakriti and Purusha, matter and spirit together with knowledge is discussed. Chapter 14, entitled The Yoga of Classification of Three Gunas. 1 to 4 shlokas, the glory of knowledge, evolution of the world from Prakriti and Purusha is described. 5 to 18 shlokas, the qualities of Sattva, Rajas and Tamas is described. 19 to 27 shlokas, means of God realization and marks of the soul who has transcended the gunas is discussed. Chapter 15, entitled The Yoga of the Supreme Person. 1 to 6 shlokas, description of the universe as a tree and the means of God realization. 7 to 11 shlokas, the Jivatma or the individual soul is described. 12 to 15 shlokas, God and His glory is described. 16 to 20th shlokas, bodies of all beings and Jivatma and the Supreme Person is discussed. Chapter 16, entitled The Yoga of Discrimination between the Divine and the Demonical Properties. 1 to 5 shlokas, the divine and the demonical properties described with their fruit. 16 to 20 shlokas, marks of a man possessed of the demonical properties and their domination are described. 21 to 24 shlokas, instructions about renouncing conduct opposed to the scriptures and the exhortation to follow the scriptures. Chapter 17, entitled The Yoga of Classification of the Threefold Faith. 1 to 16 shlokas. 1 to 6 shlokas, discussion on faith and on the fate of the men who perform austere penance not enjoyed by the scriptures. 7 to 22nd shlokas, different kinds of food, sacrifice, penance and charity are described. 23rd to 28th shlokas, 23 to 28 shlokas, describe the meaning and the intention of uttering Om Tat Sat. 23 to 28 shlokas describe the meaning and intention of uttering Om Tat Sat is explained. Chapter 18, entitled The Yoga of Liberation Through the Path of Knowledge and Self-Surrender. 1 to 12 shlokas describe the subject of tyaga or relinquishment. 13 to 18 shlokas describes the causes of karma according to the Sankhya system. 19 to 40 shlokas describes the classification of knowledge, action, doer, reason, firmness and joy according to three gunas. 41 to 48 shlokas describes the duties attaching to each caste and the fruit of their performance. 49 to 55 shlokas describes the path of knowledge described. 56 to 66 shlokas describes the path of karma yoga or selfless action together with devotion. 67 to 78 shlokas describes the glory of the Gita, God realization through practice of renunciation.